All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Detection Showcase, where we're going to be distilling the top threats, techniques, and trends over the last few months. So as many of you may know, every year we publish a report. It's called the Threat Detection Report, and we basically look at all of the data we have that relates to the most prevalent threats and techniques that we detected, as well as some trends that we're seeing. So we're about 6 months into 2023. So we decided to pull the data for the kind of our threat technique and trend data year to date and see what's changed, what's different, what's the same, and sort of talk about it with you all. So I am Brian Donohue. I am the Principal Information Security Specialist here at Red Canary. I understand that title probably raises more questions than answers. So I write blogs. I help write our threat detection report. I basically work with our technical teams in our SOC and our CERT, our detection engineers, our threat intelligence teams. I work with them when they find interesting things, whether it's research they're doing, threats they're finding, and then I help them create public resources to educate the InfoSec community. So I am here with my colleague, Katie Nichols, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Brian. My role might be a little easier to explain. I'm the Director of Intelligence Operations at Red Canary, so I lead both our intelligence and threat hunting teams. So our intelligence team very tied into detection and response. What are the things we are seeing affecting our customers, affecting the community? Brian and his team help us share that out in webinars like this and in different blog posts we share with the community as well. And then lead our team of threat hunters who try to help customers figure out what bad things are going on in their environments. So yeah, happy to be here today to talk through some recent trends. As Brian mentioned, right, we sort of based this initially on our 2022 data, but shocker, adversaries don't pay attention to calendar year. So as we probably anticipated, a lot of the things that adversaries were doing last year, they've done in the first half of this year as well. Here is our agenda for today. And if you notice, we're roughly kind of organizing this kill chain style a little bit, right? We're going to start on the left with initial access, some of the things we've seen in terms of trends of how adversaries get in environments. And then moving forward, I'm going to throw it to Brian talking about some identity and email, stealers as well in that kind of lateral movement. How do they enable that access? And then we'll wrap up talking about both ransomware and extortionware as a category, thinking about where a lot of the bad things happen to the right of that kill chain. So we won't adhere strictly to the kill chain, but roughly organize our sections that way. So let's dive right in. Initial access, how do adversaries get into our environments? Some things have been the same for years, some things are a little bit new. So talking through some of these, one thing not on the slide intentionally, yes, adversaries are exploiting vulnerabilities to get into enterprises. I didn't throw that on the slide because it's sort of the way things just are all the time, right? So exploitation of vulnerabilities continues to be something adversaries are doing. We'll have an example later on talking about MoveIt and that recent exploitation by a Clop ransomware group. So that is sort of a given, right? Didn't even talk about it because it's there. A couple of trends that we think are worth pointing out in terms of initial access. First, we and many others across the community have seen a significant shift in terms of web delivery towards adversaries using two related techniques, search engine optimization poisoning, as well as malvertising. This is something we started to see the end of 2022. Again, this isn't new, but what's sort of new here and worth paying attention to is how widespread this is becoming. We have examples on a daily basis of employees who go in their enterprises and they have legit search terms and they're, for example, searching for software, right? The top search results in their search engine actually lead to malware. We'll have an example of that. And related malicious ads, that same idea, adversaries are starting to get really good at knowing what defenders are doing. We're locking down email gateways. So they're realizing, hey, search engines are open. That's a great way I can get my malicious content into enterprises. So search engine optimization, malvertising, continuing to be a really important, significant trend we've seen so far this year. Another one, and this one, somewhat controversial, physical hardware, specifically USB drives, continue to be a very common vector that we see in a lot of enterprises. If you're like, that's ridiculous, this never happens, Thank goodness. That's great for your enterprise. And that means you probably have some things locked down to prevent this. But the reality is, across a lot of organizations who use USBs based on, hey, maybe you have remote offices in different parts of the world, it's an easy way to get data around, right? This is a really common intrusion vector that we see, both newer clusters, which we'll talk about, like Raspberry Robin, and some of these older worms, Gamaru, aka Andromeda, that actually other adversaries took over that infrastructure. So don't overlook physical USBs. It's very easy to dismiss it as like, that's old news, it never happens. Based on our visibility, it does. Other one to think about, email, right? Of course, email continues to be a key initial access vector for adversaries. And the interesting thing that we track with email is really what link and attachment types are adversaries using. Last year we saw developments around mark of the web changes, right? Adversaries moving away from macros. And so far this year, right, early in 2023, we saw kind of an odd surge of OneNote attachments and links being used. Why OneNote? Again, maybe respond to that mark of the web changes. But sometimes we can't always predict why adversaries are going to switch to certain attachment types. So far this year, we're seeing a lot of oldies but goodies, right? HTML, a good way to smuggle in malicious content. PDF, zip files continue to be really common initial access email delivery. So just keeping an eye on those trends. We can't always anticipate where adversaries are going to shift with email attachments and links, but the reality is they do tend to cycle through. Last year we talked about container files like ISOs. We can reasonably anticipate at some point adversaries are going to loop back. So luckily, once you've made detections for kind of one category of attachment type, you should be good for the next time adversaries loop around to that. Diving into a couple of specific examples, right? Our number 4 threat in 2022, Gootloader. This is a malware family delivered via, right, search engine optimization. This year so far, Gootloader is number 11. Though we'll see that was through the end of May, so might be making a late surge in the end of the year. Still continues to be a really common malware family we see. And so what does this delivery look like of Gootloader? Well, as a user, I search things in search engines. This is a normal thing to do, not a bad thing to do. All right, so if a user goes in and searches for something like simple agreement for future equity, I'm going to use that example because we found in particular, Gootloader tends to optimize terms with that word agreement in there. So legal agreement, agreement form, that kind of search term. So user goes in, searches for that in their favorite search engine, and they look at their results. And towards the top of those results, there's something that has those keywords. Hey, click here, simple agreement for future equity. Great. As a user, I'm looking at that. It's matching exactly what I searched for. So I click and I get redirected to a malicious website. Ultimately, my browser downloads a zip file containing some malicious JScript. Looks a little bit like it does on the slide. And as you can see on the slide, the name of that zip file is exactly what the user searched for, right? Talk about specifically targeted. If that's exactly what I searched for, and I'm like, cool, this is a zip file, it probably contains the legal agreement form, or the agreement form I'm looking for, I'm really likely to open that and execute it. So I want to highlight this because this is not easy to protect against. Like some organizations try to block search engines, not going to be super effective. So being aware of this and then thinking about trying to detect that initial execution, really key, right? Luckily, this is a predictable pattern. We're able to identify this. And in the report, our threat detection report, we have some examples of how you could try to detect Gootloader early on in that chain. That's on the web delivery side. Again, search engine optimization. Another example, USB delivery. As I said, USB delivery continues to be something we see across a lot of environments. On the slide, we have a little chain of intrusion activity from a cluster we identified called Raspberry Robin. This one so far this year is number 7, so remains in our top 10 threats that we see and starts with an infected USB drive. One of our continued intelligence gaps for Raspberry Robin is actually, where does it come from? And one of the things we've heard from different victims is that a lot of times those USB drives inserted into enterprise networks, previously they were inserted into print shop machines. Like if you're going to, somewhere to get photos printed out, something like that, you use a thumb drive for that and then insert into your corporate network. So we really would love love to image one yet. If anyone has one, we'd love to take a look. So somehow gets from there onto that USB, then into the enterprise, then downloads additional content, common thing malware does, right? Uses some of those living off the land binaries we know are really common, like run DLL32, and then sends out, right, with MSI exec, sends out the host name and the username, right? The adversary is collecting that. And what others have seen, we've seen some different follow-on activity. For example, other ransomware precursor families like SOC Golish being delivered by Raspberry Robin. So kind of concerning chains of activity after that initial USB delivery via Raspberry Robin. So that's the scariest stuff. Yes, initial access. We all know this, adversaries get into your environment. One of the themes throughout today, we're going to be talking about some actions to take, right? It's not just enough to be like, ooh, scary threats, but here are some things that we found are really effective in protecting against these threats. First off, search engine optimization, as I said, that is really tough to protect against, unless you tell people don't use search engines. But malvertising, right? Malicious ads, kind of a similar type of thing where adversaries will purchase a malicious ad to get to the top of those search engine results. If you deploy ad blocking software enterprise-wide, that can actually mitigate a lot of those. So one thing to think about action there. In terms of email delivery, adversaries using lots of different file types. One, we still see adversaries use container files like ISOs. So a simple thing you can do is deploy group policy to say, hey, don't auto mount to my machine any ISO files, any container files. And on the USB delivery side, as I mentioned, in some organizations, USB delivery, they're like, wait, that's still a thing? Make your organization that type of org. Right? Think about implementing group policies to restrict actions that files can take from USB devices, right? A really simple way and effective way that you can try to mitigate some of this USB malware delivery. So with initial access being covered, I'll pass it off to Brian on identity.
Yeah, so kind of step 2 here in our contrived kill chain is identity. And we've watched identity as a trend both from sort of the defensive perspective of, gaining increased access to identity alerting and controls, but also as a thing that adversaries tend to target pretty early on in the attack lifecycle. So high level, how are adversaries compromising identities? Well, put very, very simply, they may try to steal credentials, and they can steal these credentials through, a wide variety of means, right? Like sometimes it's just a phishing attack, right? It's social engineering where you get tricked into willingly giving over these credentials. Maybe you're buying sort of troves of credentials on the dark web to perform attacks like credential spraying. Maybe you're using brute force attacks to try and guess them, or even malware that steals information, which like passwords, which we're actually going to be talking about stealers a little bit later here. Increasingly, though, for a lot of organizations who have multi-factor authentication, either fully implemented or partially implemented across their organization, stealing and using those credentials is kind of just the first step, right? You also have to then be able to bypass multi-factor authentication. And there are multiple ways of doing this as well. The kind of 2 we're going to briefly touch on here are MFA exhaustion and the abuse of these legacy protocols. And throughout this section and the email section that follows it, we're going to try to tie all of this together and eventually close with kind of how you can help protect yourself against all of these different variations of attack. So, right? One of the enablers of identity compromises that we're seeing increasingly is this technique called MFA request generation, right? So like first and foremost, caveat, any multi-factor authentication is going to be better than no multi-factor authentication at all. However, not all MFA prompts are created equally. So to describe the technique just a little bit, multi-factor request generation basically is built on this idea of bombarding users with MFA prompts. And because there are many different prompt options that include things like push notifications, calls, text, emails, number matching, like the list goes on and on, there are a number of different ways that an adversary can try to basically annoy a victim into accepting an MFA prompt to sort of circumvent an actual working MFA control. But before we get into sort of what you can do about that, I want to touch briefly on this other sort of technique that we were just talking about, which involves downgrading authentication protocols, right? So MFA request generation is all about sort of socially engineering or annoying a user into just accepting an MFA prompt when you have MFA implemented. Authentication protocol downgrading is about trying to trick a system into not using that MFA prompt at all. So certain legacy or older authentication protocols simply don't support MFA enforcement. So adversaries abuse these legacy authentication protocols to bypass MFA altogether. And this is a topic that the smart folks on our threat research team have been doing a lot of thinking about. And their research has recently sort of manifested in these two blogs that relate to this idea of ROPC. It's the Resource Owner Password Credential Grant. And I actually have two links I'm going to send you all. This is honestly, I just want to pump these. So if you guys want to learn more about two kind of interesting ways that adversaries are, actually it's one way that adversaries are sort of able to abuse Microsoft protocols to bypass authentication. And then this BAV2 ROPC thing is us clarifying a subject about which there has been a great deal of misinformation on the web. So I'll share those two with you after I'm done talking here. However, the big point here is that this idea of legacy authentication protocols is by no means an abstract problem. These numbers come directly from Microsoft, who claim that more than 99% of password spraying abuses legacy authentication protocols. More than 97% of credential stuffing attacks abuse legacy authentication protocols. And then kind of on the flip side of that, there are 67% fewer compromises in Azure Active Directory organizations when those organizations have these legacy authentication protocols disabled. So, interestingly, when I ran the numbers for our techniques that we've detected this year, right? So every year we count up the top MITRE attack techniques that we saw. We write about them in our threat detection report. When I ran those numbers for the first 6 months, the biggest change that I saw was this precipitous rise in this technique, T1078.004 cloud accounts. And this rise is it's not that these sorts of attacks are new. It's that we have more and more customers who have started adopting identity alerting, and we have been trying to help them solve a problem that I'm going to talk about in this next slide that I suspect anyone here who has ever worked in a CERT or a SOC is going to be extremely familiar with. And it's a tale of three different types of identity alerts. The first are these unfamiliar location alerts, right? So basically, this is when logins are occurring from unusual places. So I'm Brian, I live in Virginia. If Brian's account logs in from Morocco, maybe we have a problem and you can get an alert. On the other hand, there's these impossible travel alerts. So Brian in Virginia is logged in right now from Virginia. If Brian logs in from Morocco in 2 seconds, Brian obviously couldn't have traveled from Virginia to Morocco that fast, so that might trigger that sort of alert. And then last, but certainly not least, are these anonymous logins, right? Logging in via VPNs or Tor exit nodes and stuff like that. So all of these, in the abstract sense, seem like really, really great alerts, but they are problematic. And it's for kind of two basic reasons. There may be more, but I think that these two reasons kind of cover it, right? They can be extremely noisy. So you may get too many of them to effectively action them, in which cases SOCs might ignore them. For instance, I worked in a SOC many years ago where we had a company that had lots of maritime vessels, and they were a Microsoft shop, and we would get bombarded with these because they were on ships, right? So obviously they were getting weird locations and impossible travel all the time, and we just ignored them all. And I've heard this same thing from many organizations who aren't running ships, right? So the other problem here is that they lack necessary context. So even if you don't ignore them oftentimes, it's hard to determine the validity of these alerts. And I have a nice little example of this in the next section of this webinar. So there are ways, however, that you can sort of still use these alerts even though they may be noisy and they may lack context. In some cases, you may be able to apply secondary detection criteria to the affected accounts, right? So like maybe just having that impossible login isn't enough, but if that impossible login is happening on a computer, that's tied to the identity where the login's happening, and then there's some very suspicious endpoint activity happening, maybe those two things together become like a high fidelity signal that something bad is happening. If you're getting a lot of them, maybe you're only interested in filtering, or maybe you're only interested in seeing successful logins, right? Maybe you just say, hey, I get too many of these. If the login's unsuccessful, I don't want to see them. And on that note, like if you can effectively suppress and tune these things, you can see a lot fewer of them. And then at the risk of saying something that you've all probably heard a billion times, baselining is pretty important here, right? So like if you understand the expectations for ISPs and locations, like that can be super helpful. And on that note, nearly every business email compromise attempt we've detected has spawned from a VPN. So taking this all together, thinking back to when I was talking about, the different ways that you can implement MFA prompting. So what are some practical solutions that you can implement to help solve sort of all of these problems? One, and this is a good solution, is when you're using MFA, instead of maybe using pushes or like, text notifications, maybe using something like number matching is a good solution, right? With those push notifications, you can get annoyed and it's easier to just hit yes. Like people will do that. You can also accidentally hit yes. It is very hard to accidentally implement, like it's very hard for you to accidentally enter in the correct numbers in a number matching scheme. And also like, it's probably less annoying to just continue to ignore MFA prompts than it is to actually go in and look at the numbers and match them and send them off to whatever MFA system you're using. An even better solution here is something like phish-resistant MFA. So if anyone here has ever worked for the government, they have those PIV cards. Like that would be a form of phish-resistant MFA where you have some sort of hardware or device-based token that is tying like the actual user to that login. And then a great source of layered defense, and I'll have a link for you on this one too, is conditional access policies, right? So this will let you create policies that prevent unknown devices from logging in. You can also block legacy authentication protocols or use them to sort of enforce MFA across your enterprise. So as I said, once I'm done talking, I will send you all those links. Now, one, like, I guess you could say like one subset of identity where we see a lot of adversary activity is in email, right? So we wanted to talk a little bit about threats to email. And very, very simply, I think about threats to email in two like overlapping categories, right? There's the social engineering side of it, where maybe you're using typo squatting or you're spoofing a domain or you're otherwise pretending to be someone. Things like business email compromises sometimes only rely like strictly on a social engineering aspect. Reach out to someone, ask them to wire money to a sketchy bank and hope that they do it, right? And then there's like the account takeover side of it, which is kind of more in line with what we were talking about in the last section of identity. Maybe an example of this could be payroll fraud. I'm actually going to show you a business email compromise example that involved a takeover here in a moment. Like the how of this basically is everything we just talked about in the identity section. But there are also other elements to look for, things like suspicious email forwarding rules and other activity that's very, very visible within your email clients. So an example, right? What you're looking at right here is a confirmed Red Canary threat detection. Like very briefly, when we detect a threat, like our detection engineers build a timeline of events that show everything that happened. This is one very small section of one such timeline. And looking at this, you may reasonably be asking yourself, what am I looking at? Well, there are 4 things here for the purposes of this story that matter. It's actually 5, but I'm going to start with just these 4. we've got an employee at one of our customers who has created an email rule named ... And that email rule says, hey, look for anything that includes any of the following. One of those things is the website of a vendor of this customer of ours. Another thing is a name of an accountant at that vendor, which already you should be like, this seems like it's pretty bad. And then, any emails that include the words fraudulent, phishing, malicious, suspicious, or hacked. And then the actual rule is if you see any of those things, delete this email. So basically what's happening here, it appears, is that an adversary has taken over a legitimate person's email account. They've created a rule because they want to email the accountant at the vendor and try and perform a business email compromise scheme, and they do not want this legitimate employee to see any of this activity. Now, interestingly, like we were just talking about, we also saw an impossible travel alert in conjunction with this activity. So the impossible travel alert basically said, hey, we're seeing a login from this city. It's not the normal city. Also, it's coming from an IP range that we've associated with a VPN block or a data center that's basically acting as a VPN. So think about this in isolation. Like, just this identity alert on its own is probably not sufficient to know that anything bad has happened. It's a little suspicious, but I wouldn't really know what to say. However, in conjunction with this, we've got a lot more evidence of something bad having happened. So one way, remember before we were talking about secondary detection criteria to apply to these alerts? Well, in the case of email, if you want to detect threats purely in email, or if you want to supplement these identity alerts, there are a lot of things you can use. So in this case, we got this alert. We also triggered on a combination of detectors that were looking for email rule names consisting of single characters and email rules to delete messages. So in tandem with these identity alerts, particularly for email, it is suspicious in email if adversaries are creating, if anyone really is creating suspicious email rules, things that are automatically deleting emails, right? Also, look out for emails being sent to strange folders. Oftentimes what we see are email rules that just say, hey, take any emails coming from this person in the payroll department and automatically forward them to this RSS feeds folder where we know no one looks. Beyond that, you can monitor for suspicious strings, things like payroll, invoice, in this case, fraudulent, malicious, phishing. Even that rule name, ... can work as a suspicious string to build detection logic on top of. Now, I want to kick it back to Katie to sort of talk about another thing that we're seeing quite a lot of.
Yeah, and I appreciate folks in the chat. Bill gave a +1 to what Brian was saying about the impossible travel alerts, maybe not some super useful ones out of Azure Active Directory and others. But yeah, I think Brian made a great point in that last section about sometimes combining those lower fidelity sources, the email rules plus the impossible travel. But yeah, I think as Brian noted, this is an industry-wide problem. So sometimes you're going to be able to correlate, sometimes not. But moving into our next kind of section here. All right, Brian talked a lot about identity. Identity is everything. Adversaries want to gain credentials, ideally admin, and that leads into this category of stealers, right? Malware that steals things. We see lots of different malware. We see kind of Trojans, banking Trojans that are actually just malware in general, ransomware precursors, which we will talk about. But stealers as a category, these are worth paying attention to because they, as the name suggests, steal things, right? Stealers tend to steal information like passwords, credentials, bookmarks. They take screenshots, they take cookies, other system information, etc. And why this is worth paying attention to is that those things that adversaries can capture through stealers are useful regardless of your motivation, right? We think of these stealers a lot as sort of crimeware, but any adversaries who's trying to get credentials in an environment to further their objectives can use a stealer, and that's helpful for that. So a couple of top stealers, and I might be having some internet issues here. Brian will tell me if I am, I'm sure. So top stealers we've seen include a really common one, Redline. So far this year, it's number 19 in our top rankings. Raccoon, number 25 in our top rankings. So doesn't seem that high, but right, the thing is that as a category, these do rank highly, right? There's so many different stealers, a new one pops up every day. And right, if we start to look at combined, if we said just stealer, there'd be number 5 rank, right? They would hit our top 10 in terms of their prevalence. So challenge with stealers, and we see this almost every day. Some team puts out research, a lot of good malware research out there about some new stealer, right? A few that have popped up early this year, Dark Cloud, Mystic, Bandit, Atomic, Stealer, not Red Team. There are so many of these, and it can be really tough, like any other threats, to try to catch up with all of them, keep up with all of them. So bad news, lots of stealers popping up. Good news, however, is that they have a lot of similar patterns, right? One of the challenges we have is actually we'll see things like these text files stolen or other, execution techniques, and we don't know which stealer it is because they all have such similar code bases. So there's a lot of them out there, but can be a little bit easier to identify, right, when we know the behaviors that are common to a lot of them. So moving forward a little bit, talking about stealers, one common question that I get, what about AI threats, right? AI, kind of those AI generated threats, adversaries can use AI to write malware. They can. However, I consider that as a longer term future problem. Not to get off track too much, but the other thing I would say is if adversaries are using AI to write malware, maybe that's a good thing because AI tends to pull from things that already exist. But a more clear and present danger, I would say, from AI is people who want to use AI tools like ChatGPT, right? So I go search in my search engine, and then as we talked about search engine optimization, towards the top of those results, I see ChatGPT, and I'm like, I want in on that AI awesomeness. Let me download ChatGPT. So on the slide, we have an example of a recent stealer infection that came in. User got fooled. ChatGPT, cool. I want to use that AI as awesome. Execute it. Yeah, as you see in the analyst note there, the legit ChatGPT developed by OpenAI. This binary here has metadata for some company that does not make ChatGPT. Turned out this was actually a stealer, very similar to Vidar, which is a common stealer we observe. So yes, AI can be scary. Adversaries can use it, but I would say watch out for users trying to download AI software and using that as a masquerade for stealers. Just a recent example of something we've seen combining what we suspect was search engine optimization with delivery of a stealer.
So in terms of things that so before I said, hey, cloud accounts, this is something we haven't been seeing a lot of. When I reran the numbers, one thing that we continue to see a lot of that stealers leverage is process injection, right? And there are and it's not just stealers, right? If you've got good defensive coverage for process injection, that's going to protect you against a very, very wide variety of threats. The reason for that is because it's kind of sneaky and it's tricky to detect, right? It helps adversaries accomplish goals in a way that's difficult to observe and detect. And so obviously adversaries are going to continue to use it. So I did want to include a little bit of information about some stuff that you can implement that will help you mitigate, and then in the next slide, detect process injection. So all of the things on the screen here are either directly built in or things that you can configure on Windows. So, and I'll very briefly explain kind of what each of these do, and you can go look at them for more information. But App Locker essentially lets you limit what users are allowed to run, to include things like files and applications and executables, scripts, DLLs, and more. Windows Defender Application Control does just exactly what it sounds like it does. Attack surface reduction rules offer you a lot of ways that you can limit the efficacy of of process injection and a wide variety of other threats. And then there's also things like Defender Exploit Guard. And then maybe like here at the bottom, one that is super important is this LSA injection prevention, which effectively allows you to limit the kinds of processes that are allowed to inject into LSAS, which is a process that stores a very, very great deal of sensitive information that relates to sort of security policy and accounts and credentials and stuff like that. And then on the detection side of this, like I kind of looked through our library of detection analytics and thought like, what are the commonalities here in ways that we detect process injection? And this is kind of them in a very simple form. And you can find kind of more detailed descriptions of this in our threat detection report, but like PowerShell injecting into anything is suspicious. Processes executing without command lines can be very suspicious, like if those processes usually execute with command lines. Same thing with like seeing network connections where there shouldn't be, right? Like maybe an example of this is notepad.exe making network connections. Like should Notepad be making network connections? In a lot of instances, probably not. And then going back to the thing I said on the last slide, like a lot of adversaries and malware will inject into LSAS to steal credentials. So like anything injecting into LSAS that shouldn't be is worth keeping an eye on.
Thinking about mitigating stealers more broadly, right? Process injection, one technique you can try to mitigate, detect on. One simple thing, right? User awareness isn't the answer to mitigating any of this, but it's one piece. Saw that example of a stealer coming in via user trying to download ChatGPT. We see a lot of stealers introduced that way, via users trying to download software or a lot of times video games. So maybe you don't have a trusted video game download site for your org, but in terms of software people need to do their jobs, educate users, where do you go to get that? Or what's the process for that? Right? Because a lot of what we see, it's people trying to download software, and adversaries know people like to download software, and whatever they present to that user, they're going to execute. So some user awareness can go a long way in terms of trying to mitigate stealers. In terms of storing credentials, right? One of the things that most stealers do, stealing those credentials a lot of the time from browsers. And so thinking about enterprise-wide, think about something like how do you store securely those credentials in something like a password manager, not in the browser, right? A lot of users don't think about this, but if an adversary gets on your system, it's pretty easy for them to steal browser credentials. And then lastly, this is something a lot of people overlook, right? We have this tendency, okay, there's malware on a machine. Let me just remove the malware. Let me reimage the machine maybe. But the reality is, if you're responding to a stealer or anything, any adversary activity that's stolen a credential, you also need to have in your incident response plan to reset those credentials, right? It's a really simple thing. It can be so easy to overlook, but think about, especially in the case of stealers, what's been stolen and what do you need to action based on that? So that kind of wraps up our stealer section. Now getting towards the right in the actions on objectives phase, right, left, either way, whatever chain version you want, ransomware. Not just going to talk about ransomware, we're going to broaden this a little bit to extortionware, right? And we continue to have this debate, as we have for probably the last year and a half, of is ransomware still a threat to be worried about? And I will say definitively yes. Although ransomware isn't quite making the headlines like it used to, I feel like a week can't go by when there isn't a huge ransomware attack against a school, against a hospital, against some organization. What I will say is the ransomware landscape has shifted a little bit, right? And I added specifically extortionware as a title to this section because, you know, a lot of people think of traditional ransomware encryption. Okay, that still happens. But now we're increasingly seeing examples of intrusions, and we'll have an example coming up in a moment, where there's no encryption at all, right? This extortion where adversaries will steal data and then just say, pay us, or we're going to post it to the dark web, release it publicly. And the reality is that you might need slightly different responses to these. So let's talk through kind of what the traditional intrusion chains look like in ransomware and extortionware. So here's what I think of as sort of a traditional old school ransomware intrusion chain, right? Adversaries gain initial access, they do some reconnaissance, they learn about the environment. Often they'll bring on a tool like Cobalt Strike or Sliver to do some lateral movement, move around the environment. Then once they have a good foothold, they'll steal information, they'll exfiltrate it. This is the so-called rise of double extortion. Majority of ransomware adversaries now, in addition to doing that encryption, before they encrypt files and data, they're also going to steal it, right? So exfiltrating and then encrypting that data. Now, the interesting thing is, consistently, if you look at Red Canary's top 10 threats, no ransomware itself makes it into the top 10. That is good. The good news is that where we focus and where we encourage everyone to focus is on the left of this chain. Try to identify the initial access, right? We'll talk a little bit of ransomware precursors we see. Those affiliates that we know often will get access to an environment, then pass off access to the people who do the exfiltration and the encryption. And so sometimes our customers, people will ask, hey, do you detect ransomware? Yes, we do, but you don't want us to. You don't want us to detect those encrypted files being written. You want us to detect that very predictable chain that we traditionally see, initial access via something like Qbot, and then reconnaissance, and then we see Cobalt Strike, and we see a set of commands, and we call and say, stop this before it gets to the end phase. So thinking about ransomware as a chain, right? It seems so simple, but a lot of people just think about the end outcomes, really think about it in terms of detecting early. And a lot of things can happen in those early phases. What we call the kind of tools and malware in those early phases, we refer to them as ransomware precursors. There are tools, groups, malware families that we know have previously been used by ransomware actors or affiliates. So again, if you look at our top 10 threats for 2022, and so far this year, no ransomware groups are in there. But when I ran the numbers January through May, since June isn't over yet, out of our top 10 threats, which is threat groups, malware, tools, right, we have 7 on the slide that have been seen as ransomware precursors. Malware families like SOC Ghoulish. We continue to see that a lot, right? Knowing that if you see SOC Ghoulish in your network, you need to take action. Because in the past, SOC Ghoulish has sometimes led to exfiltration and encryption. Of course, we have some dual use tools. Impacket is one that's used legitimately by vulnerability scanning tools. Mimikat's often used by both testers and adversaries. But the idea being, look for these ransomware precursors. That's the approach we take since ransomware is still a threat. So I mentioned at the beginning, right? It's not just ransomware now. We also have extortionware. And this is a bit of an oversimplification in the interest of kind of making the point that sometimes this chain from initial access to exfiltration and extortion cases can be very quick. You all likely heard on the news about that MoveIt vulnerability exploited a couple weeks ago, and we continue to see the Clop ransomware group, right, releasing data from those victims. Well, the adversaries gained initial access, exploited that vulnerability. They got access to those MoveIt file transfer utilities, and, right, of course, there was a little bit of persistence, a little bit of privilege exfiltration, but within a phase of minutes, about 30 minutes or so, adversaries dropped a web shell and stole data from MoveIt, right? Unfortunately, in cases like this, you don't get that time for, oh, adversaries doing reconnaissance, learning about our network, running those commands. We don't get the opportunity to move laterally because a file transfer system like MoveIt has data that can be stolen directly. And so you really have to think about, again, ransomware is a category, it's kind of a little fuzzier now. Are we talking about encryption? Are we talking about exfiltration? We even hear about triple extortion, threatening and denial of service. So think about how you might need to prepare and respond a little bit differently to each of these situations. Some actions, right? Ransomware precursors, detecting those early still works really well. And that's where the threat detection report, we have tons of ideas for detection opportunities to identify these tools, these malware families, these affiliates early on in that chain. right? While not every ransomware intrusion chain follows that longer path, enough of them do that it's still really worth looking at all of those ransomware precursors. The other thing to consider, especially as we're talking about file exfiltration and extortion, make sure you're monitoring file transfer utilities, right? rclone is one we've seen used for a while in ransomware intrusions. MoveIt was a more recent one exploited, as well as remote monitoring and management tools, RMM tools, because we know adversaries often will use these legitimate tools during their intrusions. And then lastly, right, the MoveIt example is a good example of why this is so important. Sometimes these extortion chains are very quick, and it's very easy to blame victims, right? That MoveIt exploitation was very fast, and some people had data stolen, right? We try to blame, but in that case, even very good defenders, I would argue, you'd have to move fast to try to prevent that or mitigate that compromise. And so realize that that's the reality. We have data in so many places, in cloud environments and these file transfer utilities. There's a chance that your data might get stolen and you might be in an extortion scenario by these adversaries. So highly recommend thinking about that as part of your incident response plan. If an adversary calls us or messages us, says, hey, we have data, or starts emailing our customers, right, saying we have your data, how would you respond? Got to have that in your incident response plan. So as we start to close out, right, again, as we mentioned, we started this slide deck and this conversation looking at 2022 data and threats across these different areas. But unsurprisingly, right, what happened last year is still happening this year. Looking at initial access, looking at how adversaries gain access to identities, what they do with those. As Brian talked about, increasingly important and challenging as defenders, right? Email threats, looking at the trends there, making sure you're thinking about BEC as a category and what adversaries do in terms of, right, operating these SaaS environments, manipulating email rules. A lot of bad can happen there. And wrapping up, thinking about stealers, everything they can do in our environments, and then not just ransomware encryption, but also the extortion angle. And throughout this presentation, we've dropped in all kinds of blog post links. There's much, much more in our threat detection report that, again, is still very applicable. What I would say is that it can be overwhelming. We've just thrown all of this at you. Take one thing, right? One action. Hey, maybe I can look for a single ransomware precursor, try to improve my detection. Even sometimes small actions are better than taking no action at all. That's what we got. So, I think we have a couple minutes for questions and answers.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and read these questions out to you because I think, honestly, most of them are questions that you're going to be more equipped to answer than me. So the first kind of pair of questions relate to USB attacks. I won't call anyone out by name. So one of the folks in the audience said, hey, like USB-based attacks have been associated with Chinese threat actors in the past. Have you found, any other nation state actors leveraging these threats? And then sort of more generically, like, have you seen other actors generally outside of nation states abusing these attacks?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go off too much on state-sponsored actors. I would say think about how state-sponsored actors aren't necessarily the only threat everyone needs to worry about. But I will say generally, adversaries of a lot of different motivations use USB devices for initial access. So what the question asker is probably referring to, PlugX is a common malware family that not just used by Chinese threat actors, but they often still do. Groups in the realm of Mustang Panda and other overlapping names often use PlugX, which is delivered often via USB. Chinese actors are not the only ones doing this. Raspberry Robin, we don't know the true attribution of Raspberry Robin, but it seems like it's in more of a criminal direction. So criminal actors certainly use USBs. Of course, for anyone who's been doing this for a while, the classic Moonlight Maze Agent BTZ stuff or Russian actors. There was actually a report, I'll drop it into the chat, from Symantec earlier this year about a Russian group that Symantec calls as Shuckworm, using USBs as well. So yes, USB, not just a Chinese threat actor thing. Many other actors use that as well, which is why it's worth paying attention to.
And so a second question here, which I think is kind of this might be too broadly scoped for us to really effectively answer. I'll start with the simple part of it and leave the hard part of it to you, Katie, as I typically like to do. So have we seen any ransom extortionware incidents where cloud SaaS apps were being targeted? And the easy part of this is they specified Dropbox. So I'll say, and I think we wrote a blog about this, that we worked some IR incidents in 2021 maybe, where we were seeing adversaries using file transfer utilities to upload stolen data up into, like, I don't remember what it's even called anymore, but it's whatever mega upload has become. But like, I guess the trickier question there is about whether or not we've seen ransomware kind of targeting like more like direct cloud apps.
Yeah, I can't recall a case where we have seen that directly. I'm certain it's happened. I don't have a public link off the top of my head. The one I did think of, and like we are big on like anywhere who has the visibility, whatever companies have the visibility, let's look to them because none of us sees everything. So team at Invictus IR had a blog post about AWS ransomware, because this is something it's definitely worth thinking about, right? We talked about cloud, talked about ransomware. How do those two things combine? This was a really interesting read from us in thinking about how you could use CloudTrail events trying to detect some of those behaviors. So we've kind of used that as inspiration for how we're detecting in AWS. So I don't think we've directly seen something, not that I can think of off the top of my head, but I do know from other cases from other teams' visibility that yes, cloud SaaS apps are appealing in this for the same reason that like MoveIt was appealing for adversaries, right? I don't have to touch an endpoint. I can just get access to that specific application and steal all the information there. So.
And then the last question I think relates to, I don't know if I can actually click back to this slide. It relates to our traditional ransomware like focus here to avoid this graphic that we love so much. There it is. So the audience member is asking, why is there no emphasis on privilege escalation here, since like sort of elevation of privileges is required for lateral movement? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you field it, Katie.
Yeah, we've chosen to specifically focus on a narrow set of tactics and techniques and trends, right? We're not covering everything. So as the question asker noted, like privilege escalation is absolutely needed. I would say that a lot of the kind of creativity as well as the identity focus that Brian talked about, I think of that, a lot of that is actually related to privilege escalation, though we didn't specifically call it out because as adversaries are trying to do their intrusions, right, they want admin credentials. And so I would say that for us, credential stealing or use of tools like Mimikatz is very closely tied to privilege escalation. And that's how we see a lot of adversaries doing that. Certainly there are other techniques for privilege escalation, exploiting specific vulnerabilities. But I would say by and large, where we see a lot of that happening is stealing more privileged credentials. Brian, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that's a good answer. My secondary answer to that would be that like we could have also included execution in here. It's like at some point we're trying to limit the size of the graphic so that it makes sense. So like I would say that there are both arbitrary and like good reasons for why we didn't include that here. All right, well, I think we are right about at time here, Katie. Do you want to go to the thank you slide so people have a way to contact us if they need to?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, everybody. We hope this was a useful expenditure of your time.
Thanks, everyone.